The West African Democratic Congress currently has two people who both believe they are the legitimate national chairman of the same political party, simultaneously. Two sets of letterheads, two sets of directives being issued to state chapters, two factions both claiming the right to speak for the ADC, both filing communications to INEC demanding recognition. And INEC, the same commission that decides who gets on a ballot, whose name appears on a form, whose party affiliation is valid, has gone conspicuously, deliberately, and strategically quiet. Now, INEC does not simply have the power to acknowledge a party leadership dispute and walk away. It has the power to resolve it. It has exercised that power before in other parties, in other crises. The legal framework exists, the precedent exists, the mechanism is sitting right there in the Electoral Act. So here is the question that nobody in the Nigerian press has put on the table. Who benefits from INEC staying silent? And is that silence a decision or is it an instruction? Stay with me, because by the time this analysis is done, that question will have an answer. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. The ADC leadership crisis did not begin as a public spectacle. It began exactly where these things always begin in Nigerian politics, behind closed doors. A contested national convention, allegations that due process was bypassed, parallel congresses held in disputed venues, with each side producing its own minutes, its own list of delegates, its own declaration of results. What the public eventually saw was the downstream effect: two chairmen, two secretariats issuing conflicting directives, and a party apparatus that has effectively split at the seams. The surface narrative being pushed in the media is straightforward. This is an internal party crisis. Factions, court cases, Congress disputes. Nothing new in Nigerian politics. The ADC is a small party. Move on. That framing is exactly what some people want you to accept, because the buried story is not about party administration. It is about institutional capture. In Nigeria, a political party's legal existence, its ability to field candidates, to put names on ballots, to access electoral machinery, flows entirely through INEC's register. Whoever INEC formally recognizes as the legitimate leadership of the ADC does not just win a title, they control the candidate sponsorship letters that determine who can contest elections. They control who accesses party funds, and they hold the keys to a political platform that, as I will show you, is becoming strategically valuable in ways that almost no one is currently discussing. Now, why is this happening at this particular moment? The timing is not accidental. The ADC has been quietly repositioning itself since the 2023 elections as a potential coalition vehicle. Several heavyweight political figures, some from the Southwest, some from the Middle Belt, have been in back-channel negotiations about using the ADC as a platform for 2027, rather than attempting to defect to the Labour Party or build entirely new structures from scratch. The ADC offers something rare in Nigerian politics. It is already registered. It already exists. You don't need to build it. You just need to control it. That context transformed an internal party squabble into a battle worth fighting at the national level. The fight is not about the ADC as it is today. It is about what the ADC can be used for tomorrow. Here is the fact that refrains everything, and it is a fact that almost no one covering this story has highlighted. The ADC, despite its small national vote count, holds active party registration in all 36 states and the FTC, 37 jurisdictions, full national footprint. This is extraordinarily rare. Most third parties in Nigeria are regionally concentrated. They are strong in one zone and paper thin everywhere else. A party with genuine all-state registration is an acquisition target for any political entrepreneur who needs a vehicle with national reach but without the ideological history and internal factions of the APC or the PDP. The crisis is not about who loves the ADC. It is about who wants to use it. Now, Let's talk about the institutions involved, because this is where the real leverage lives. INEC sits at the center of this crisis, not as a passive observer, but as the body whose recognition of one faction over the other effectively ends the dispute with the full force of state authority. The moment INEC formally acknowledges one chairman, that chairman controls the party machinery in every consequential sense. The other faction becomes a rump, still capable of litigation, but stripped of operational power. Alongside INEC, the Federal High Court has been invoked by at least one faction seeking injunctive relief, and the ADC's own internal dispute resolution structures, whose legitimacy itself is contested, have issued conflicting rulings that each side cites selectively. Let me lay out the legal framework precisely. Section 222 of the 1999 Constitution establishes the foundational conditions for political party recognition in Nigeria. The Electoral Act 2022, particularly Sections 77 through 82, governs internal party democracy, including the procedural requirements for congresses, the obligation to notify INEC before conducting them, and INEC's powers to monitor party elections. Critically, these sections require that party congresses comply with the party's own registered constitution. That last requirement is where everything starts to unravel, because the ADC's own constitution contains a provision that neither faction has publicly addressed, and we will get to exactly what that means in a moment. Now, where does the law create ambiguity and who benefits from it? INEC empowers INEC to monitor and supervise party congresses, but it does not provide an explicit step-by-step procedure for what INEC must do when two parallel congresses produce contradictory results. Courts have historically filled that gap, but litigation in Nigeria moves slowly, sometimes by design, sometimes by dysfunction, and sometimes because the right connections ensure that interim injunctions are granted to both sides simultaneously, creating a legal standstill that can last for years. In that environment, ambiguity is not a legal problem to be solved, it is a weapon to be wielded. The faction with stronger institutional relationships, more sophisticated legal counsel, or better informal lines to INEC's administrative hierarchy can delay recognition for the opposing side until that delay itself determines the outcome. You don't need to win in court, you just need the other side to run out of time or resources before a ruling is handed down. Has INEC been placed in this position before? Yes, and the institutional history here is important. During the PDP's internal crisis in 2015, INEC's recognition decisions were widely accused of tracking the political preferences of the federal executive rather than the procedural merits of each faction's claim. In the lead-up to the 2023 elections, INEC's handling of administrative disputes within the Labour Party was cited by Labour insiders as selectively delayed at moments that were consequential for the party's internal factional balance. The pattern is documented. It is not an accusation. It is a recurring characteristic of how INEC behaves when the outcome of a party dispute intersects with the interests of whoever controls its appointment pipeline. And that is the detail that most analysts are missing entirely in their coverage of the ADC situation. INEC commissioners are appointed by the president, subject to Senate confirmation. That appointment chain runs directly through the federal executive and the legislative leadership. INEC's institutional independence is constitutionally declared but structurally compromised by the fact that its leadership serves at the pleasure of a political process. When INEC chooses silence over intervention in a party dispute, the question that demands an answer is, whose silence is this? Is it the Commission's caution, or is it a posture that was requested? There is a specific relationship between INEC's current senior leadership and the figures who controlled that appointment pipeline that has not been examined in the context of the ADC crisis. And one of the factions in this dispute has documented affiliations with political actors who are themselves connected to individuals with direct influence over that appointment pipeline. When we get to why INEC's silence has lasted this long, that relationship will tell you more than any press statement ever will. Let us now look at the strategic architecture underneath this crisis, because this is where the real decisions are being made. Who benefits from this situation, specifically? The faction that currently holds physical control of the ADC National Secretariat in Abuja has what Nigerian institutional practice regards as a structural advantage. Possession matters. A secretariat with a functioning staff, a working phone line, and a letterhead being issued regularly establishes facts on the ground that courts and commissions implicitly weight in their assessment of legitimacy. But the faction with stronger procedural compliance, better documentation of their Congress notification to INEC, more defensible evidence that proper observers were present, has the stronger legal position. These two advantages are being deliberately played against each other. One side is building time through litigation, the other is building legitimacy through occupation. It's a race in two different lanes. Beyond the factions themselves, there are external beneficiaries who are rarely discussed. Any political figure currently in back-channel negotiations to use the ADC as a 2027 platform needs this dispute resolved, and resolved on terms favorable to whichever faction they are dealing with. Until it resolves, no serious political investor will commit resources to the platform. That sustained uncertainty serves the interests of those who do not want the ADC to consolidate as a viable opposition vehicle at all. Keeping the party in crisis is itself a strategy. Now, who risks losing? The ADC's existing candidates and elected officials face direct, concrete consequences. Ward councillors, state assembly members, real people with real political careers who depend on the party machinery for re-election. Their ability to seek candidacy depends entirely on which secretariat is authorized to issue the sponsorship letters that accompany nomination forms. These individuals are being used as leverage by both factions, and nobody is advocating for them. Let us be precise about the 2027 electoral calculation behind this. Nigeria's 2027 presidential and governorship elections will be shaped by the availability of viable platforms. The APC and PDP remain structurally dominant, but are both fractured internally in ways that make them uncomfortable vehicles for certain political entrepreneurs. The Labour Party's post-2023 trajectory is uncertain. Its internal cohesion has been tested repeatedly, and its national spread is thinner than its 2023 presidential results suggested. In that landscape, a party with a national registration footprint, no dominant ideological identity, and a leadership crisis that can be resolved by the injection of the right legal resources and political backing, that is an acquisition opportunity. The ADC crisis is a competition over who gets to resolve it, because whoever resolves it owns the platform. Now let us be clear about the regional and ethnic dimensions of this dispute, because they are not incidental. The two primary factions draw their key figures from different geopolitical zones. The ADC's registered constitution contains provisions, contested in their interpretation, about the rotation of the chairmanship across regions. The Southwest and North Central blocks have competing claims rooted in those zoning provisions. This is not merely a personality clash. It is a dispute about whether the party's power-sharing architecture is actually enforceable, or whether it is decorative language that disappears the moment someone with enough resources decides to ignore it. Pay attention to the silent stakeholders. There are several prominent political figures who have publicly or privately explored the ADC as a 2027 vehicle and have gone completely quiet since the crisis escalated. They are waiting. They need to see which faction consolidates enough to be a reliable partner before committing resources or public association. There is also a group of state governors in the Mid-Belt who have historically maintained ADC structures at the state level as political insurance, backup platforms in case their primary party relationships deteriorate. None of them have commented publicly on the national crisis. That collective silence from that specific group of actors is a signal. They have something at stake in the outcome, and they are watching which way the institutional wind moves before they speak. Now, follow the money. because this is where abstract institutional analysis becomes concrete. Political parties in Nigeria receive statutory allocations from INEC's Party Support Fund based on their registration status and electoral performance. A party in recognized legal existence draws those allocations, and control of the secretariat is control of the account those funds flow into. Beyond statutory allocations, there are the informal financial flows. Donations solicited in the party's name, the platform fees charged to candidates purchasing nomination forms, the revenue generated from organizing events and conventions. Both factions have been issuing candidate forms. Both have been collecting fees. Until INEC formally rules, both are spending money whose legal basis remains unresolved. The financial exposure of that ambiguity on both sides is significant. But here is what almost nobody has connected yet, and it changes the entire picture. Let us step back from the ADC specifically and look at what this crisis means for Nigeria as a whole, because the implications run deeper than one party's internal war. The ADC crisis is a live stress test of Nigeria's intra-party democracy framework. If INEC continues to decline intervention, while the courts take months, potentially years, to produce a definitive ruling, it establishes a precedent that is genuinely dangerous. It tells every political actor in the country that parallel congresses held in violation of a party's own constitution can effectively paralyze a national party indefinitely without any institutional authority stepping in to enforce procedural accountability. That precedent is transferable. It's a documented template. Any actor who wants to disable or capture a party platform in the future now has a playbook. Run a competing congress, file a lawsuit, generate enough procedural noise to keep INEC hesitant, wait for your opponent to run out of resources or patience. The institutional weakness on display in the ADC situation doesn't stay in the ADC. What are the economic consequences for ordinary Nigerians? In states where the ADC has historically provided genuine electoral competition at the local government level, parts of Kogi, Kwara, Nasarawa, and Ogun, that competition is being suppressed by institutional paralysis. Candidates who might have challenged incumbents are deterred from purchasing forms when the legal status of those forms is uncertain. Reduced electoral competition at the subnational level correlates historically with reduced accountability in public spending. When incumbents face no credible opposition, the incentive to justify how contracts are awarded and how local budgets are administered weakens. The political crisis has an economic cost that never appears in headline coverage but is felt in communities.
What about security? Parties in crisis are parties that cannot manage their own organizational networks responsibly. In the North Central and Middle Belt zones where the ADC has meaningful organizational presence, the informal structures that party chapters maintain, youth wings, women's groups, ward coordinators, become operationally unmoored when the national structure collapses. Unmoored political networks in those zones have historically been susceptible to recruitment by non-state actors or to exploitation by patronage systems that are connected to armed groups. The security community should be watching this more closely than it currently is. And on national cohesion, if this dispute resolves along ethnic or regional fault lines, if one faction wins because it has stronger ethnic patron networks or because INEC's recognition happens to follow a regional political logic, it sends a signal to every minority party in Nigeria about how leadership disputes are actually resolved. That signal corrodes confidence in internal party democracy and reinforces the narrative that in this country, institutions serve power, not process. Remember the relationship I flagged between INEC's senior leadership and the federal executive appointment chain. Here is exactly what that means in this context. One of the two ADC factions has documented affiliations with political figures who are themselves connected to actors with direct informal influence over how INEC's senior leadership was constituted. That does not mean a phone call was made. It does not mean a directive was issued. In Nigerian institutional politics, influence of this kind does not usually require explicit instruction. It operates through the awareness that certain outcomes are preferred and through the professional instinct of people who understand what is expected of them if they want to continue in their roles. If INEC's silence is not procedural caution but strategic patience, waiting for one faction to consolidate enough on the ground that recognition becomes a formality rather than a decision, then the appointment relationship is the mechanism through which that patience was signaled. That is not a proven claim, but it is the question that the absence of INEC's intervention has made unavoidable. Here is the specific data that most analysts have completely missed, and it reframes the national stakes in a way you were not expecting. The ADC polled approximately 70,000 votes in the 2023 presidential election at the national level, a negligible figure for national standards. But disaggregate that number geographically and something significant appears. In specific senatorial districts in Kogi and Nasarawa states, ADC candidates outperformed their national average by a factor of 6 or 7. The party has genuine localized strongholds that are visible when you look only at aggregate national numbers. Those strongholds are in states that are active electoral battlegrounds for the 2027 governorship contests. Whoever controls ADC's candidate sponsorship machinery in those specific districts controls electoral outcomes that are disproportionately significant relative to the party's overall national size. The fight over the ADC chairmanship is not just a fight over a title. In specific geographies, it is a fight over governorship results.
The ADC crisis will not appear in US State Department briefings. It will not generate a UK Foreign Office advisory, but it is part of a pattern that international democracy support institutions track very carefully: the systematic weakening of third-party and opposition party infrastructure through institutional attrition rather than outright suppression. USAID, the National Democratic Institute, and IFES have all published analytical frameworks for evaluating intra-party democracy in emerging democracies, precisely because party capture is one of the most documented pathways to democratic backsliding. You do not need to ban opposition parties, you just need to ensure they are perpetually too internally fractured to mount coherent challenges. The ADC situation fits that documented pathway with some precision. Nigeria is also navigating a particular diplomatic sensitivity right now. The 2023 general elections attracted significant international criticism of INEC's conduct, concerns about result management, transmission systems, and consistency between polling unit results and announced totals. In that context, INEC's handling of the ADC crisis is not purely a domestic matter. It is evidence being evaluated by international observers who are trying to determine whether Nigeria's electoral management body has genuinely reformed or whether it is operating under the same informal political logics it has been accused of historically. A second consecutive cycle of INEC appearing to favor politically connected outcomes in administrative decisions will affect Nigeria's positioning within ECOWAS democracy frameworks and will be cited in AU election observation discourse leading into 2027. That is not abstract. It affects Nigeria's credibility as a leader of democratic governance on the continent, a role Nigeria has historically claimed and must now actively demonstrate. For Nigerians in the diaspora, in the UK, the US, Canada, and across Europe, the ADC crisis individually may seem remote, but it sits within a cumulative pattern of institutional unreliability that shapes how diaspora capital flows. The approximately $20 billion in annual remittances that diaspora Nigerians send home is connected at a structural level to diaspora confidence in Nigeria's institutional trajectory. Every crisis of this kind that resolves through political capture rather than legal process is a small withdrawal from that confidence. Those withdrawals compound. What I'm about to show you in the next section is where this story becomes truly dangerous, because it is where the assumptions that most Nigerians are making about this crisis fall apart.
Before I give you the strategic outlook, let me address the strongest arguments being made on the other side, because intellectual honesty demands it, and because understanding the counter-arguments is part of understanding the strategy. The most credible defense of INEC's current posture is this: the Commission may be legally constrained from adjudicating between two factions when the matter is already before the courts. Under this reading, INEC acting unilaterally to recognize one faction while litigation is pending could itself constitute a contempt of court or an overreach that a sitting judge could use to invalidate whatever INEC decides. INEC's silence under this interpretation is not political calculation, it is procedural self-protection. And that is a serious argument. It deserves engagement rather than dismissal. Here is why it does not fully hold. The Electoral Act 2022 gives INEC specific monitoring and supervisory rules in party congresses that do not evaporate the moment someone files a lawsuit. INEC has previously issued clarifying administrative statements, not full adjudications, but formal acknowledgements of which Congress met the procedural requirements of the Act in other party disputes where courts were already involved. Those statements were not successfully challenged as contempt. The precedent exists. INEC choosing not to even issue a procedural assessment in the ADC case is a choice, and the choice not to use an available tool is itself a decision that demands explanation. Now, let me correct 3 misconceptions that are shaping how most Nigerians are reading this story. The first misconception is that this is just another party crisis that has nothing to do with ordinary people's lives. I understand that fatigue. But control of party machinery is directly connected to who gets placed on ballots, who wins local government chairmanships, and who administers the contracts and appointments that flow from those offices. At the grassroots level, in the specific communities where ADC has organizational presence, this crisis has direct consequences for which people control public resources. The second misconception is that the ADC is too small to matter strategically. This misunderstands how political value is calculated in a coalition system. A party does not need to win the presidency to be strategically important. It needs to hold enough electoral real estate in the right places to make it a necessary partner in coalition arithmetic. The ADC's 2027 value is not its national vote share, it is its geographic footprint in specific swing districts. Small parties with the right footprint have repeatedly been kingmakers in sub-national elections. The third misconception is the most dangerous, the assumption that the courts will sort this out before it matters. Nigeria's judiciary has demonstrated across multiple electoral cycles that intra-party cases can be litigated for years without producing a definitive resolution, that interim injunctions can be granted to both sides simultaneously, creating legal gridlock, and that final rulings frequently arrive after the electoral window they were meant to protect has already closed. Trusting the judicial process to resolve this on a timeline relevant to 2027 without external institutional pressure is an optimistic assumption, and the political actors involved are counting on Nigerians making exactly that assumption. Here is the piece of evidence that both sides and every analyst covering this story have completely missed. ADC's own registered constitution, the copy on file with INEC, contains a dispute resolution provision that specifies an internal mechanism. A panel drawn from the party's board of trustees, which must be formally convened and exhausted before any faction is entitled to approach INEC or the courts for external intervention. It is a mandatory pre-litigation step. Neither faction has publicly acknowledged that provision, neither has complied with it on record. If that reading is correct, then both factions are currently procedurally vulnerable, and INEC has a defensible, legally grounded administrative basis to decline recognition to either side until the internal mechanism is exhausted.
The question is whether anyone in INEC's legal department has actually raised this in internal deliberations, or whether it is being held in reserve as the rationale that will be cited when INEC eventually acts in whichever direction it has already decided to move. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Let me give you 3 specific scenarios for how this moves forward, and then tell you what signals to watch that will tell you which path is being taken. The first and most likely move: judicial acceleration by the better-funded faction. Whichever side has access to more legal resources will attempt to obtain a federal high court ruling, even at first instance, even interlocutory, before INEC reaches any internal deadline connected to the next cycle of off-cycle elections. A court ruling, even a preliminary one, gives INEC the legal cover to decline recognition to either side without appearing to have made an independent political choice. Both sides understand this. The race is now partly a litigation funding race. And funding in Nigerian political litigation does not come from party membership fees. The second scenario: executive pressure through INEC's appointment chain. If one faction has stronger connections to the current administration, and the evidence on that question points in a specific direction, the informal pressure on INEC will intensify as the 2027 registration and monitoring timelines begin to compress. Watch specifically for administrative movements within INEC's Party Monitoring Directorate, reassignments of senior staff, new internal guidelines on parallel Congress documentation, or a quiet revision of the Commission's procedures for handling competing factional claims. These administrative adjustments will not generate headlines, but they will be the signal that a decision has effectively been made. The third scenario: coalition defection. If the crisis is not resolved within the next 6 months, key ADC stakeholders, state-level party structures, major financial backers, serious 2027 candidates will begin exiting the platform for more stable alternatives. The Labour Party, NNPP, and a potentially restructured SDP are all available destinations. That defection would collapse the ADC's geographic value and end its 2027 relevance entirely. And here is the critical point. That outcome, the slow dissolution of the ADC as a viable platform, is itself something that certain actors outside the party may be deliberately engineering through prolonged delay. Killing a party without banning it, that is the quiet version of political suppression. Here are the specific signals that will tell you which way this is moving before any announcement is made. Watch INEC's Party Monitoring Unit for any communication, public or leaked, about the documentation it has received from either faction. Watch the Federal High Court in Abuja for interlocutory rulings in the next 60 days. Watch which governors or serving senators are the first to publicly endorse a specific faction, because the first establishment figure to take a public position will tell you which way the institutional wind is already blowing. And watch the ADC's bank accounts. If INEC's statutory party allocations begin flowing to one faction's designated account rather than being held in administrative limbo, recognition has effectively already happened. It just has not been announced. If INEC's culture of strategic silence in intra-party disputes continues unchallenged, not just in the ADC, but as a systemic institutional pattern, then Nigerian opposition politics will increasingly be decided not by voters, not by internal party democracy, and not even by the courts. It will be decided by whoever has the most effective access to administrative recognition machinery. That trajectory leads towards a de facto two-party consolidation, not because Nigerian voters prefer it, but because the institutional environment makes meaningful third-party development structurally impossible. In 5 years, if the ADC crisis resolves through political capture rather than legal process, it will be cited as one of the case studies that explains how Nigeria's multi-party framework quietly collapsed from the inside. Who benefits from INEC staying silent? And is that silence a decision or an instruction? Based on everything this analysis has laid out, the appointment chain, the factional affiliations, the geographical value of the ADC's specific strongholds in Kogi and Nasarawa, and the 2027 timeline, the silence is most coherently explained as a decision made under instruction, not a formal written directive. That is not how these things work in Nigeria, and we should not be naive about that. It operates through political signals received and acted upon by people who understand what outcomes are preferred and what the professional consequences of non-alignment might be. The faction with the stronger connection to the federal political apparatus is being given time to consolidate on the ground, while the courts move at their usual pace and the commission maintains its studied neutrality. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of how Nigerian institutional politics has operated across multiple administrations, under the APC, under the PDP, and now. What changes is not the mechanism. What changes is who benefits from it. That demands not outrage, it demands vigilance, documentation, and the kind of sustained analytical scrutiny that makes quiet institutional capture harder to execute without consequence. The ADC leadership crisis began as an internal party dispute. What this analysis has shown is that it is now a live test of something more fundamental: whether Nigeria's electoral institutions can resist being used as instruments of political selection, choosing winners not through votes or due process, but through administrative recognition and the deliberate management of silence. The question that matters is not which faction has the more sympathetic story, or which chairman presented himself more credibly at a press conference. The question is whether INEC acts as an institution that upholds process or as an actor that manages outcomes. That distinction will define the credibility of every election this commission administers between now and 2027. One question for the comments, and I want your honest analysis. If INEC ultimately recognizes one ADC faction before any court has issued a final ruling, based purely on which faction appears more administratively organized on the ground, is that a legitimate exercise of INEC's constitutional powers, or is it institutional capture wearing the mask of procedure? Tell me what you think. I read every comment. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.